When Major Frank McCoy climbed through the inspection panel of the captured Japanese bomber that morning in January 1945, he expected to find answers. What he found instead stopped him cold. His camera trembled slightly as he documented what sat before him on the tarmac at Clark Air Base. A pristine Mitsubishi Betty bomber, tail number 763-12, abandoned intact during the American advance across Luzon. The tropical sun beat down on its cylindrical fuselage, that distinctive shape that had earned it the nickname among Allied forces. 20 meters of polished metal resting on the tricycle gear like some massive mechanical cigar. Wings stretching 25 meters tip to tip, completely undamaged. Twin 14-cylinder radials, 1,500 horses each sitting there ready to roar. This wasn't wreckage salvaged from a crash site. This was an operational bomber, whole and complete, left behind by a crew who'd simply walked away. McCoy had examined dozens of Japanese aircraft across the Pacific Theater. Shot down Zeros, crashed dive bombers, fragments pulled from jungle crashes, but nothing had prepared him for what waited inside those wings. He pried open the access panels, expecting to find the standard array of military aircraft systems. Reinforced fuel cells, protective coatings, safety mechanisms, all the engineering that keeps aviators alive when metal meets fire. Instead, he found thin aluminum, maybe 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from the outside world. No self-sealing rubber compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression beyond basic extinguishers, no protective layers of any kind, just bare metal skin between volatile fuel and enemy rounds. The silence that fell over his technical intelligence team wasn't the quiet of concentration. It was the silence of men realizing they were staring at something that defied every principle of Western military aircraft design. This couldn't be standard. No air force would intentionally build bombers this way. No nation would ask its crews to fly into combat in aircraft with completely exposed fuel systems. Yet here it sat, pristine and intact, its wings holding the evidence that would reshape American understanding of Japanese aviation doctrine. The mathematics contained within this single aircraft would rewrite tactical manuals. Every assumption Allied pilots held about enemy capabilities was about to be demolished by what this bomber revealed. 4 years earlier, smoke had still been rising from Pearl Harbor when 82 of these same bombers lifted off from Formosan airfields. Their target was Clark Field itself, the primary American air base in the Philippines. December 8, 1941. The Japanese formation arrived at 12:35 in the afternoon, flying at 20,000 feet, completely beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns positioned below. 27 bombers from that initial wave dropped 636 bombs across the runways and facilities in patterns so precise they seemed choreographed. Then the Zeros came in at treetop level, their machine guns finding every American aircraft that had survived the bombing run. 12 of 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses destroyed outright. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk reduced to burning wreckage. 45 minutes. That's how long it took to eliminate American air power in the Philippines. Lieutenant James Harrington watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation withdrew northward. What struck him, what he'd write in his combat report later, was the perfection of their approach. High-altitude formation, flying, completely untouchable, then the fighters dropping down to finish what the bombers started. Not a single American plane got airborne in time to engage. The few that managed to scramble arrived to find empty sky. The Betty bombers had struck from bases 460 miles away and departed without a scratch. No American bomber could match that range in 1941. The Japanese had demonstrated a capability that seemed almost supernatural, the ability to hit targets from distances that defied conventional military logic. 2 days later, on December 10th, 26 of these same bombers joined older models in attacking Force Z, a British naval task force built around 2 of the Royal Navy's premier warships. HMS Prince of Wales, a battleship representing Britain's newest generation of naval power. HMS Repulse, a battle cruiser modernized through the 30s. The attack began just after noon. Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves, their torpedo runs executed with a precision that stunned the British sailors below. The Betty carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each one weighing 840 kilograms, with 205 kilograms of explosive in the warhead. Designed specifically for shallow water, these weapons ran at depths that could strike ships even in coastal areas. Prince of Wales took at least 6 torpedo hits. The underwater explosions tore massive holes below the waterline. Flooding overwhelmed every damage control effort. The battleship began listing severely, water pouring into compartments faster than pumps could handle it. Repulse absorbed at least 4 hits while attempting evasive maneuvers, her anti-aircraft fire claiming several Japanese aircraft but unable to stop the coordinated assault. Both capital ships capsized within hours. Prince of Wales went down at 13:20. Repulse followed 13 minutes later. 841 British sailors died in water that should have been safe, protected by warships that represented the pinnacle of naval engineering. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to final sinking. For the first time in naval history, capital ships underway and actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power in open ocean. What naval theorists had debated for decades, the Betty bomber had proven in 90 minutes. British naval superiority in Asian waters had been shattered before lunch was finished. The bomber that Allied intelligence was only beginning to understand had demonstrated that the rules of warfare had fundamentally changed. Range and precision could overcome armor and guns. Air power could sink what naval architects had believed unsinkable. Through early 1942, these bombers seemed to operate with impunity across the Pacific theater. They hit Darwin, Australia from bases 1,500 miles away. They attacked Port Moresby from airfields across New Guinea's mountain ranges. They struck Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 600 miles, projecting Japanese air power across ocean expanses that should have been beyond any bomber's reach. Allied commanders struggled to counter this strategic flexibility. American fighters based at forward positions lacked the range to intercept bombers departing from distant bases. Japanese airfields sat beyond Allied striking distance, while Japanese bombers could attack Allied positions at will. This asymmetry persisted through the first 6 months of war. The Betty participated in virtually every Japanese offensive operation: Philippines, Malaya, Netherlands, East Indies, New Guinea, Solomon Islands. It supported naval operations throughout the theater. It performed reconnaissance missions no Allied aircraft could match. But there was a condition to this dominance, a prerequisite that Japanese planners had built their entire strategy around. The Betty's effectiveness depended entirely on limited Allied fighter opposition. When formations could strike without interception, when they could approach targets at high altitude beyond anti-aircraft range, when they could deliver weapons and depart before fighters arrived, the aircraft was devastatingly effective. These conditions characterized the first half of 1942, when Allied air strength remained scattered and depleted. But by mid-year, the tactical picture began shifting. American fighter strength increased. Wildcats gave way to Hellcats and Corsairs. Pilot training improved. Tactical doctrine evolved, and Betty crews began reporting losses that couldn't be explained away. August 8, 1942, 23 Betty bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Tsavo Island. In the engagement that followed, 18 of 23 bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 aviators died in what became the single worst loss for the type during the entire campaign. The survivors reported the same thing fighter pilots had been saying across every engagement. The Betty exploded into flames with minimal damage. 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along the fuselage or wings produced catastrophic results. The aircraft earned nicknames that spread through American squadrons like wildfire: Flying Cigar, One Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo. All references to the bomber's terrifying tendency to bloom into fire from even minor battle damage. By October, When Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal commanding a fighter squadron flying Corsairs, the Betty's reputation had transformed completely. "First time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easy they went down," he'd report later. "Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings and they'd explode. We actively hunted them. They'd become among the most vulnerable targets in Pacific skies, transformed from feared weapon to sought-after prey in less than a year." But the true extent of the vulnerability, the engineering decisions that made such catastrophic losses inevitable, wouldn't be fully understood until American forces began capturing intact examples. November 1942. Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, technical intelligence units discovered Betty bombers with varying levels of damage. Initial examinations confirmed what pilots had reported. The fuel tanks had no protection whatsoever. Engineers with the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit conducted the first detailed analysis, pulling back wing access panels to reveal fuel cells with no protective measures. Thin aluminum construction, no rubber sealant layer, no protective coating, no fire suppression systems. Multiple bombers examined at Buna showed identical characteristics. This wasn't battle damage. This wasn't field modification. This was standard Japanese design, repeated across every aircraft they examined. The implications staggered the analysts. American bombers by 1942 universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 had incorporated them from the C model onward. The B-24 featured them from early prototypes. Even fighter aircraft like the P-38 and P-47 had protected fuel systems. Self-sealing technology used layered rubber compounds that swelled on contact with fuel. When bullets or shell fragments punctured the tanks, the rubber sealed the holes, preventing fuel loss and fire. The technology added substantial weight, but American military doctrine considered this penalty essential and non-negotiable. Crew survival wasn't optional, it was fundamental. Yet here was Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in thousands, operating across the entire Pacific theater, with fuel tanks offering zero protection. The weight saved by eliminating self-sealing systems, armor plating, and fire suppression equipment was immediately apparent when engineers calculated the numbers. But the cost in crew lives was becoming equally obvious in loss statistics that mounted with every engagement. The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 would provide the most complete technical analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system. Their report, classified secret and distributed to all Allied air forces, detailed specifications that explained both the bomber's extraordinary capabilities and its catastrophic vulnerabilities. Empty weight: 6,741 kilograms. Remarkably light for a bomber of its size. Maximum takeoff weight: 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity: 4,780 liters, distributed across 8 unprotected tanks, 4 in each wing, positioned in the wing's center section where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. Top speed: 428 kilometers per hour. Maximum range: 6,034 kilometers, exceeding 3,700 miles. Service ceiling: 8,500 meters. Crew complement: 7 men, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. 7 lives depending on 2 millimeters of aluminum between fuel and fire. The fuel system design was particularly revealing. 8 tanks arranged in 4 groups positioned along the wing's longitudinal axis where it joined the fuselage. This placement maximized fuel capacity by utilizing the thickest portion of a wing structure, but it also positioned the tanks directly in the path of enemy fire during combat. Any attack from the side or below would inevitably strike fuel. The aluminum construction provided no protection. The absence of self-sealing compounds meant even small punctures would leak fuel continuously. American engineers calculated that the weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. That weight savings translated directly into additional fuel capacity and extended range. But the cost in vulnerability was equally calculable. Combat reports showed that Betty bombers hit anywhere in the wing area exploded with near certainty. These numbers told the story of design choices made in September 1937, when the Japanese Navy issued requirements that would define the bomber's entire existence. Top speed of 398 kilometers per hour, cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, range of 4,722 kilometers unloaded, or 3,700 carrying 800 kilograms of bombs or torpedoes. The requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy in the late 30s. Japan's empire stretched across vast Pacific distances. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy needed bombers capable of striking enemy positions far beyond carrier aircraft range. Bombers that could operate from land bases to support naval operations across the intertheater. Existing Japanese bombers fell far short. The older model then in service had maximum range of approximately 3,000 kilometers. American bombers like the B-17 had even more limited range in early variants. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1937 could strike targets at the distances Japanese planners envisioned. The Navy's requirements weren't arbitrary. They were calculated based on distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any future Pacific conflict. Formosa to Philippines, 460 miles. Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 miles. Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, thousands of miles. The bomber that could meet these requirements would give Japan strategic reach no other nation possessed. But the requirements also reflected assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed surprise and initiative would provide protection for long-range bombers. They assumed enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. They assumed the war would be decided quickly before enemy industrial capacity could generate overwhelming force. Every assumption would prove false within months. The man tasked with achieving the impossible was Kairo Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 30s, absorbing European aeronautical engineering principles before returning to Japan. He understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand compromises Western air forces would never accept. Honjo assembled a team of engineers at Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities to tackle the design challenges. They analyzed every aspect of bomber design, calculating weight budgets for every component. They studied existing bombers from multiple nations, identifying where weight could be reduced without compromising structural integrity. They experimented with new construction techniques and materials. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed approximately 0.8 kilograms. 4,780 liters meant roughly 3,800 kilograms of fuel weight at full load. To achieve required speed with this fuel load, the aircraft needed minimal weight. Every kilogram added to empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. These two requirements existed in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating would require hundreds of kilograms to protect crew positions and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight through rubber compounds and additional structure. Fire suppression systems added weight. Redundant safety measures added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent achieving required performance. Honjo made the decision that would define the Betty throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. Fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction. No self-sealing compounds, no armor plating around fuel cells, no fire suppression beyond basic extinguishers, no redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, range, and achieving the Navy's performance specifications. The decision wasn't made lightly. Honjo understood the risks. His team calculated the vulnerabilities that unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew combat damage to wings would likely prove catastrophic. But they also knew the Navy's requirements couldn't be met any other way with available technology. The choice was between an aircraft that met performance specifications with known vulnerabilities, or an aircraft that failed to meet requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. The first prototype flew October the 23rd, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement the Navy had specified. Speed exceeded expectations, range surpassed projections. Payload capacity satisfied operational needs. Production began with initial models reaching operational units in April 1941. By December, approximately 180 were in service with the Japanese Navy. These aircraft would form the backbone of Japanese land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. The combat debut at Clark Field and against Force Z demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities under the specific conditions of early 1942. When facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond enemy fighter range, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its range allowed strikes from bases enemies considered safe. Its speed permitted rapid penetration of target areas. Its payload delivered meaningful damage. But these advantages depended entirely on the assumption that formations would face minimal opposition. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, the moment sustained combat became inevitable. Every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for crews. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed the fundamental flaw in the design philosophy. From August through October 1942, more than 100 Betty bombers were lost with their crews in sustained bloodletting. Japanese air forces couldn't sustain. That single mission on August 8th alone destroyed 18 of 23 aircraft with approximately 120 aviators killed. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency throughout the campaign. Formations would depart Rabaul, fly 600 miles to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. August 9th saw additional bombers lost. August 10th brought more. By month's end, the 4th Air Group had been effectively destroyed as an operational unit. September brought no respite. Formations continued striking American positions, and American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were inexorable. Japanese forces needed to strike American positions to contest control of the island. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering meaningful strike capability from Rabaul. But every mission resulted in losses that couldn't be replaced. October saw the pattern continue. American fighter strength increased as more squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot quality improved as combat experience accumulated. Tactical doctrine evolved to exploit Betty vulnerabilities more effectively. Japanese losses accelerated even as the number of available bombers declined. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 men dead. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities, transformed from feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. Japanese planners had expected losses. All military operations involved casualties, but the scale exceeded every projection. The unprotected fuel tanks that permitted 6,000-kilometer range also guaranteed that any hit to wings or fuselage would likely prove fatal. There was no middle ground, no wounded bombers limping home, no damaged but survivable aircraft. Bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized modifications were essential. Starting with aircraft produced in March, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These sheets weren't true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 kilometers per hour. Maximum range decreased by 315 kilometers. But crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They couldn't prevent fires from larger rounds or cannon shells. They couldn't stop explosions when tracers ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with a new model introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks, with capacity reduced to accommodate the leak-blocking material. The modification reduced maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original model. Approximately 60 aircraft were produced by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect the bomber's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. The war's outcome had already been determined. The vulnerability became so notorious that American forces began using the aircraft in ways that highlighted the dangers Japanese crews faced. April 18, 1943. The Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Yamamoto's death in an engagement that demonstrated both American signals, intelligence capabilities, and the aircraft's fatal weaknesses. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications indicating Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The Admiral would travel aboard a Betty with fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightnings were assigned to intercept, though only 16 actually flew after mechanical issues. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 miles at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, navigate across open ocean without landmarks, and arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. The intercept had to occur within a narrow window when Yamamoto's aircraft would be vulnerable. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 0725. They flew at 50 feet above the ocean for over 400 miles, maintaining strict radio silence. Navigation was by dead reckoning and timing. The formation arrived at the calculated intercept point with precision that would become legendary. At 0934, exactly on schedule and exactly 1 minute ahead of the calculated intercept time, the P-38s spotted Yamamoto's formation. 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6 Zero fighters as an escort. 2 P-38s broke from formation to engage the bombers while others held off the fighters. The lead Betty, carrying Admiral Yamamoto, took hits to the wing area where unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed in the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. He'd been killed by injuries sustained during the crash. The second Betty also crashed, killing all aboard. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority. American signals intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications. American planning had calculated intercept timing with 1-minute precision. Over 400 miles of ocean. American fighters had executed the mission flawlessly despite extraordinary navigation challenges. And the Betty's vulnerabilities had guaranteed that successful interception would be fatal. There was no possibility of Yamamoto's bomber surviving once it came under attack. The unprotected fuel tanks ensured any damage would be catastrophic. The vulnerability reached its most dramatic demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 Betty bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying a rocket-powered suicide aircraft beneath its fuselage. The mission required bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the weapons. The suicide pilots would then ignite rocket motors and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour toward American ships. The warhead's 1,200 kilograms of explosives would destroy any vessel it struck. But the mission depended entirely on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach release range. The formation departed Kanoya at approximately 14:30 hours, flying in tight formation with fighter escort heading toward American naval forces off Okinawa. Each bomber carried the weapon beneath its fuselage, adding substantial weight and drag that reduced speed and maneuverability. The bombers were even more vulnerable than usual, unable to evade effectively while carrying the loads. American radar detected the formation at approximately 100 miles distance. Hellcat fighters were scrambled to intercept. They reached the Japanese formation well before it approached release range. In the engagement that followed, American fighters systematically destroyed the entire formation. The bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, proved completely helpless while carrying the weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The external load created drag that reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. Not a single bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members and 15 suicide pilots died in the attack. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets couldn't survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. The extraordinary range that made the mission theoretically possible meant nothing when aircraft exploded before reaching weapon release range. The final mission flown by Betty bombers came on August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 2 white-painted bombers with green crosses departed carrying Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms with Allied forces. The aircraft, given call signs Baton 1 and Baton 2, flew to Ieshima, where the Japanese delegation transferred to an American transport for the flight to Manila. The symbolism was profound and deliberate. The white paint and green crosses indicated peaceful intent, transforming the bombers from weapons of war into vehicles of diplomacy. The call signs reference Bataan, the location where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. The crews wore dress uniforms rather than flight suits. The aircraft carried no weapons, no ammunition, no military equipment beyond what was necessary for flight. American fighters escorted the white bombers throughout their flight, ensuring they remained on prescribed course. The escort was both protective and supervisory, guaranteeing safe passage while preventing deviation from planned routes. The white bombers with green crosses became the final image of the aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle was complete. The bomber that had destroyed American air power in the Philippines in the war's first hours now carried Japan's surrender delegation in the war's final days. The aircraft that had symbolized Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness now symbolized Japan's defeat and submission to Allied terms. Production statistics reflect both the aircraft's importance to Japanese operations and the terrible cost of its design philosophy. Total production reached approximately 2,414 aircraft across all variants, though some sources cite figures as high as 2,435 when including all prototypes. The variation reflects different counting methods. Early models comprised approximately 1,172 aircraft produced from 1941 through early 1943. This variant featured the original unprotected fuel tank design with capacity of 4,780 liters. Top speed reached 428 kilometers per hour. Maximum range of 6,034 kilometers made it the longest-ranged bomber in service anywhere in the world. But the complete absence of protection systems made it catastrophically vulnerable once American fighter strength increased later. Models with increased fuel capacity and slightly higher speed accounted for approximately 1,100. 42 examples produced from 1943 through 1945. This variant increased fuel capacity, extending maximum range even further. Top speed increased slightly, but the model retained the fundamental vulnerability of unprotected fuel tanks. The modifications improved performance without addressing survivability. The only variant with actual self-sealing fuel tanks represented production that began in October 1944. Only 60 to 91 aircraft were completed by war's end, depending on source. The self-sealing tanks reduced fuel capacity to accommodate the leak-blocking material. Maximum range decreased by more than 2,000 kilometers compared to early models. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect combat outcomes. Transport variants converted from bomber airframes added another 30 aircraft. These versions carried passengers and cargo rather than weapons, serving in liaison and communications roles. One of these transports was used for the surrender aircraft in August 1945. Production continued through August, with final aircraft completed just days before Japan's surrender. Factories produced bombers at peak rates of approximately 100 aircraft per month during 1943. Production decreased in 1944 and 45 as Allied bombing disrupted Japanese industry, and as resources were diverted to fighter production for homeland defense. These production numbers made the Betty one of Japan's most numerous bombers. Over 4 years of war, Mitsubishi delivered approximately 2,400 aircraft to Japanese Navy units across the Pacific Theater. The bombers served in every major campaign, participated in every significant naval engagement, and struck targets across distances spanning thousands of kilometers. But production statistics tell only part of the story. Loss rates tell the rest. Few bombers survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational bombers remained in service. The aircraft that had numbered in hundreds in 1942 had been reduced to dozens by attrition. No amount of production could replace. Casualty statistics among crews were similarly devastating, though exact numbers remain difficult to verify. What is certain is that thousands of Japanese aircrew died in Betty bombers. Their deaths made nearly inevitable by the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. The unprotected fuel tanks created conditions where survival depended entirely on avoiding combat damage. Once hit, bombers rarely survived. Once on fire, they never survived. Crews understood these odds and flew anyway because military discipline and cultural values demanded they accept the risks, regardless of consequences. Surviving crews were unanimous in their assessment. The aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks made survival a matter of pure chance. No amount of skill, no tactical innovation, no courage could compensate for the fundamental vulnerability built into every aircraft. One former flight officer, who completed 28 combat missions before transfer to training duties, offered the most direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. The comparison with Allied bomber protection systems highlights the stark difference in design philosophy. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating protecting pilot and co-pilot seats, with steel plates ranging from 1/3 inch thick. Armored bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage. The bombardier position featured armored glass. Waist gunner positions included protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from early models onward, introduced in 1941. Similar bombers incorporated comprehensive protection. Pilot and co-pilot seats featured armor backing. Fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from early production. Empty weight reflected the substantial weight penalty of protection systems, roughly 2,000 kilograms heavier than the Betty, despite similar size and role. The weight penalty for Allied protection systems was substantial and accepted as necessary. American studies during the war demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection measures with statistical precision. Body armor reduced chest wound fatalities from 36% to 8%, a reduction of more than 75% in deaths from thoracic wounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected aircraft when damaged in combat. Protected crew positions increased survival rates by providing shielding from shell fragments and small arms fire. Armored glass prevented pilot casualties from head-on attacks. Bulkheads compartmentalized the fuselage, preventing fire or damage in one section from spreading throughout the aircraft. The comprehensive approach to crew protection reflected American doctrine that trained crews represented assets more valuable than aircraft, which could be replaced more easily than experienced combat veterans. The weight cost for this protection exceeded 1,000 pounds in most American bombers, but American industrial capacity permitted this weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. American factories produced over 12,000 B-17 bombers and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. Production capacity meant American forces could field large numbers of protected bombers without compromising capability. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. The Betty's design reflected a calculation that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. This philosophy assumed achieving surprise and maintaining initiative would provide sufficient protection. It assumed enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed the war would be short and decisive. All these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1942, American fighter strength increased to levels that made interception routine. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit every vulnerability. By 1943, formations suffered such devastating losses that missions became suicide operations. By 1944, bombers could barely operate in daylight against American opposition. The mathematics of the war were written in fire and loss. Every advantage that made the aircraft formidable in early 1942 became irrelevant once sustained combat began. Range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching targets. Speed meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases. Payload meant nothing when formations were destroyed before weapon release. The examination of tails number 763-12 at Clark Field in January 1945 revealed the complete story. The unprotected fuel tanks that shocked Major McCoy weren't an oversight. They weren't a temporary expedient. They weren't a design failure. They were the deliberate choice of engineers who believed range mattered more than survival. Japanese designers had created exactly what their specifications demanded: an aircraft with extraordinary range and speed, built with minimal weight, optimized for the mission requirements they received. The tanks were unprotected because protection would have prevented achieving required performance. The decision made perfect sense within the constraints of 1937 technology and 1937 assumptions about future warfare. But those assumptions collapsed under the reality of sustained combat against an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and growing technological advantage. The bomber became a symbol of Japanese willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of tactical advantage. It became evidence of a military culture that valued mission accomplishment over crew survival. When American engineers examined the intact bomber at Clark Field, they weren't just analyzing an enemy aircraft. They were witnessing the physical manifestation of choices made years earlier. Choices that prioritized capability over survival. Choices that would cost thousands of Japanese aircrew their lives. The unprotected fuel tanks weren't an accident. They were a decision. The bombers served from the first day of the Pacific War to the last. It sank capital ships and devastated air bases. It ranged across distances no other bomber could match. But its ultimate legacy is written in lost statistics that exceeded all projections. The aircraft that opened the war by destroying American air power at Clark Field ended the war, carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white-painted aircraft marked with green crosses. The crew of tail number 763-12 had abandoned their aircraft during the American advance on Clark Field. They'd survived by walking away from an aircraft whose design made survival in combat nearly impossible. Most crews weren't so fortunate. They flew missions knowing the danger. They climbed into unprotected bombers and crossed vast Pacific distances, and they died in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires the aircraft's design made inevitable. The story is ultimately about the price of capability without protection. It demonstrates that performance alone cannot guarantee success when that performance is purchased at the cost of crew survival. The extraordinary range meant nothing when aircraft couldn't survive the final kilometers to target. The impressive speed provided no advantage when American fighters could intercept from distant bases with warning from radar systems. The payload capacity became irrelevant when formations were destroyed before weapon release. Most importantly, It reveals that military technology divorced from realistic assessment of combat conditions produces weapons that kill their own crews as efficiently as they strike enemy targets. The assumptions underlying the design, assumptions about limited opposition and short warfare duration, proved catastrophically wrong within months of the Pacific War's start. By the time these assumptions were proven false, thousands of bombers were already in service or production, and Japanese industry lacked capacity to replace them with better protected designs. Japanese designers understood the risks when they made their choices in 1937 and 38. They calculated the weight penalties. They knew the vulnerabilities. They accepted the trade-offs because they believed the performance advantages would prove decisive. They were wrong, and thousands of men paid the price for that miscalculation with their lives. The legacy extends beyond aviation history into fundamental questions about aircraft design philosophy, military ethics, acceptable risk, and the value of human life in warfare. American designers answered those questions by prioritizing protection, even at the cost of performance. Japanese designers answered differently. It stands as evidence of what happens when capability is prioritized over survivability, when range is purchased with crew lives, when performance requirements override protection considerations. The thousands of burning bombers that fell across Pacific skies marked the consequences of that philosophical difference, revealing the fundamental divide between how different nations approached warfare. American forces designed aircraft to bring crews home. Japanese forces designed aircraft to reach targets regardless of cost. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. Replacing losses faster than combat could deplete them. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition, bleeding away trained crews it couldn't replace, no matter how many aircraft rolled off production lines. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field provided the final proof of what Allied forces had suspected for years. The Betty bomber wasn't poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply didn't include bringing Japanese crews home alive. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the Pacific War. Not through lack of courage, not through inferior technology, not through poor tactics or inadequate training. Japan lost because its military philosophy accepted the expenditure of irreplaceable human assets to achieve temporary tactical advantages. Because it built weapons that asked crews to die for range and speed. Because it valued mission accomplishment over the survival of the men who flew the missions. When Major McCoy photographed that pristine bomber sitting on the tarmac at Clark Field, when he climbed through those inspection panels and found bare aluminum separating fuel from fire, he was documenting more than an engineering decision. He was documenting a fundamental choice about what warfare meant and what price was acceptable to pay. The Japanese Navy had demanded an aircraft with 6,000-kilometer range. Mitsubishi had delivered exactly that, but the true cost of that range wasn't measured in kilograms of eliminated armor plating. It was measured in the thousands of aircrew who climbed into those bombers, knowing they were flying death traps, knowing that a single enemy round in the wrong place would turn their aircraft into an inferno, knowing that their survival depended not on the aircraft's design, but on pure chance. They flew anyway. Mission after mission, throughout 45 months of war, they climbed into Betty bombers and crossed vast ocean distances toward targets defended by fighters that could destroy them with a handful of rounds. They flew because duty demanded it. They flew because military culture required it. They flew because turning back wasn't an option their training or values permitted. And they died in numbers that should have forced a reckoning with the fundamental decisions made in 1937. But that reckoning never came. The modifications attempted in 1943 and 1944 were too little, too late. Compromises that tried to address the vulnerability without sacrificing the performance that had required the vulnerability in the first place. The mathematics never changed. Protection required weight. Weight reduced range. Range was the reason the aircraft existed. Therefore, protection was impossible. The logic was circular and perfect and fatal. By the time Japanese engineers produced models with actual self-sealing tanks in October 1944, American air superiority was so complete that the modification was meaningless. The war had already been decided. The thousands of Betty bombers destroyed in combat had already fallen. The thousands of aircrew had already died. The modifications couldn't resurrect the dead or reverse the defeats or change the fundamental reality that the Betty's design philosophy had helped guarantee Japanese defeat. American pilots who fought against the Betty throughout the war remembered it not with fear, but with something approaching pity. They'd learned early that the aircraft exploded with minimal damage. They'd learned to actively hunt it, recognizing it as an easy kill that boosted their scores without significant risk. The transformation from feared weapon to despised target took less than a year. By mid-1943, encountering a Betty formation was considered good fortune among American fighter pilots. Easy kills, guaranteed victories. Aircraft that bloomed into flames from hits that would merely damage American bombers. The psychological impact on Japanese crews must have been devastating. Knowing they flew aircraft their enemies actively sought because they were so vulnerable. Imagine climbing into that cockpit, knowing your chances. Imagine strapping into a seat, knowing the fuel tanks behind you and beneath you had no protection. Imagine flying 600 miles over open ocean, knowing a single American fighter with a few good bursts could turn your aircraft into a fireball. Imagine watching formation mates explode around you, knowing you were next, knowing there was nothing you could do to prevent it except avoid being hit. And avoidance wasn't really an option when American fighters could intercept at will. The courage required to continue flying under those conditions defies easy comprehension. These weren't suicide missions in the formal sense. They were combat operations, but the survival rates made them functionally equivalent. The few surviving Betty crew members interviewed after the war spoke with remarkable consistency about the psychological burden. They'd known the aircraft was vulnerable. Everyone knew. The rumors spread through every air group. The loss statistics were undeniable, but they flew anyway, because refusing wasn't an option, and because they hoped they'd be among the lucky ones who returned untouched. Hope and discipline were all they had. The aircraft gave them nothing else. No armor to trust, no self-sealing tanks to rely on, no redundant systems to save them when damage occurred. Just thin aluminum and hope, and the knowledge that most bombers that took hits didn't come home. The contrast with American bomber crews is stark. American aircrew faced terrible dangers. They flew through flak that could tear aircraft apart. They fought off fighter attacks that could riddle fuselages with cannon fire. They suffered casualties that left aircraft soaked in blood and bodies hanging in torn turrets.